We turn again to Hebrews chapter 11. We come now to verse 35. We have looked at the various men of God in the Old Testament who manifested faith in varying situations. And as I said before, faith manifested itself in different varieties of situations. And here in verses 32 to 35, the apostle speaks of some of the outstanding achievements of faith. And we see here men who risked their lives and overcame kingdoms and were made mighty in war like some of David's mighty men, shut the mouths of lions, and many other things at great risk to their own life. One of the things we see and learn through that is that faith can be exercised only by people who have no love for themselves or for their own lives. Jesus said, "He who loves his life will lose it." Those who love their lives and are always seeking to protect it and watch over it and take care of it will ultimately lose it. But Jesus said those who are willing to lose their life for his sake and for the gospel's will finally keep it. And this is true wisdom. The man of faith is one who is willing to throw away his life, not only his physical life, but his ego, his soul life. He's willing to give it up and throw it away and die inwardly and physically so that God may be glorified. And we see here that faith could really be exercised only by unselfish people who were devoted to God's cause and to the cause of his people. And so when we ask ourselves whether we are men of faith, we need to ask ourselves this question: am I in my life unselfishly devoted to the cause of God and to the cause of his people? The infection that we have received from Adam is the infection, the deadly infection of self-centeredness. Dear friend, whether you know it or not, all of us are basically centered in ourselves and selfish. We think of our own gain in every circumstance. Even when we become Christians and we are born again, we don't get rid of this selfishness. We don't get rid of this self-centeredness. The flesh is very much with us, and that infection that's come through Adam is very much in our flesh. But we can conquer it. God gives us his Spirit so that we can conquer and overcome this infection of selfishness that there is in our flesh. And thus we can walk in victory over self-centeredness. And by faith, we can unselfishly give ourselves to God's glory and to the good of his people. That's how Jesus lived. Jesus never sought anything for himself. That's one of the clearest marks of a man of faith. And that's why these people could conquer kingdoms, obtain promises, shut the mouths of lions, quench the power of fire. They did not live unto themselves. And if this was true under the Old Covenant, this is the thing that should strike us as we read Hebrews chapter 11. If these mighty things could be possible under the Old Covenant, how much more under the New Covenant, which we have already seen in the book of Hebrews, is established upon better promises. The promises of the New Covenant are not inferior. And reading through the list of men and what they accomplished in Hebrews chapter 11 should put you and me to shame, to think of how little comes through our life. We don't have to necessarily pull down walls of Jericho or shut the mouths of lions in order to manifest our faith. There are many manifestations of faith, and we read some of them here. Some of them look very impressive in the eyes of men. Shutting the mouths of lions, quenching the power of fire, verse 34, receiving the dead back in resurrection. But then, along with them are listed others, verse 35, the middle of verse 35, who won their victory by being defeated, as it were, humanly speaking. There was victory that came in the guise of defeat. And so we find that faith not only achieves, but also endures, as we read in verse 35. Others were tortured, not accepting their release. Their faith was manifested in the fact that they endured until the end, and they were slain and they died. They did not get resurrected. They did not escape the edge of the sword, as we read in verse 34. These people received the sword, and they died in order to obtain a better resurrection when Christ comes back in glory. In verse 36, others experienced mockings and scourgings. They could not escape from their enemies. They were caught by their enemies, mocked and scourged, and put in chains and imprisoned. But that could not take away their faith. They manifested their faith not by opening the prison doors, as Peter did, or Paul did, but suffering in prison like James the Apostle did, who was slain with the sword. We read in Acts chapter 12 that James and Peter, the two apostles, were locked up by Herod. James was killed, and Peter came out through open prison doors. But that did not mean that Peter's faith was more than James's. They both had faith. One manifested in his faith by enduring until the end, and the other manifested his faith by coming out of the open prison door. And so we read here of some who were imprisoned and chained. We read in verse 37 of some who were stoned and sawn in two. They were tempted. They were put to death with the sword, in direct contrast to what we read in verse 34 of those who escaped the edge of the sword. And so both people manifested their faith. There were people, we read in the middle of verse 37, who went about in sheepskins, in goatskins. They didn't have proper clothing. They didn't sit in a royal palace like Joseph or David. No, God's will for everybody is not the same. We read that God's will for Joseph was that he should rule in Egypt as the ruler next to Pharaoh. So God took him to Egypt. But God's will for Moses was completely different. By faith, Moses forsook Egypt. God's will for David was that he should rule upon the throne as a king. God's will for Elijah was that he should go and hide in a cave, persecuted, misunderstood. God's will for some people has been that they should accomplish great mighty miracles, even raising people from the dead. But God's will for other people has been that they should be persecuted, like we read of the prophet Zechariah, who was slain in the temple. Jesus spoke of him. Abel, who never accomplished anything great, the first one in this list, but who died in faith. And so faith not only achieves, but faith endures, as we see here. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, ill-treated, men of whom this world was not worthy, wandering in deserts and mountains and caves and holes in the ground. Then we read these magnificent words in verse 39, and all these, having gained approval through their faith. Faith is not only manifested in escaping the edge of the sword, but in being slain by the sword and refusing to give up our convictions concerning God and the Lord Jesus Christ. Paul manifested his faith not only by raising dead Eutychus, not only by casting out devils, but also by refusing to give up his faith when his head was on the executioner's block under Nero's orders in Rome. So faith is not only manifested in magnificent achievements that impress the world, but also in endurance. And I want to say this, that it's easy to believe in God when God does a miracle. It's easy to believe in God when you've seen someone raised from the dead. It's more difficult to believe in God when you're wandering in sheepskins and goatskins, hiding in the deserts and in the caves. And there is where there is a greater manifestation of faith, when things are not going well and according to your desire. But all these people, the ones who achieved and the ones who endured, gained their approval through their faith. Not through what they did, not through splitting the Red Sea or raising the dead, but through their faith. In their faith they were all the same. In what they did there was a difference, but in their faith they were all the same. But yet they did not receive all that was promised. They could not come under the new covenant, because God has provided something better for us, so that apart from us they should not be made perfect. Think of this privilege, dear friends, that we have been called to something better than these men received, to come into a life of victory, to partake of God's nature, to be part of the very bride of Christ. May God help us to be faithful to our calling.